Thank you. I'd just like to follow up on the fine line of questioning from my colleague Senator Darmanin before lunch, and one of the last things we finished on was the Defence Workforce Plan, and I notice in Table 6 in the Portfolio Additional Estimate Statements that is described as investing in Defence's people, but as with many of the things I have examined over the years, when I look at the footnotes, it talks about the measure providing some $972.8 million over a period, but then goes on to say that it's being met from within the existing resources of the Department of Defence. It's what we used to call an absorbed measure. I do actually regret saying to Mr Pryor, I think it was, in 2021, that I used to scrutinise the budget documents looking for the word absorbed, because I noticed that under this government you've changed and you now use a different terminology. So it's not great for transparency. But could you talk to me about why you're labelling that as an investment when it's not actually new funding, you're taking it from somewhere else in defence?
Senator Stephen Groves, Chief Finance Officer. Look, thank you for the question. I think what we've got reflected in our pays booklet aligns with the budget papers, and ultimately the Treasurer owns the budget papers, and we've aligned the language in our portfolio additional estimates to what the measure description is as reflected in the budget papers.
Sure. So you're remarkably consistent then in a number of ways, because when I look at the further defence support to Ukraine, for example, again the footnote highlights that's $545.5 million over this year and next, but again being borne predominantly from within the Department of Defence. But then we also go on to some larger measures, such as the nuclear-powered submarine program, infrastructure and capacity investment. And it says there that it's not for publication, and the footnote says due to commercial sensitivities, but also says it's being met from within the existing resources of the Department of Defence. So we've recently seen media around the, I think, $795 million that's been given to the United States for capacity investment in their shipyards. Is that the measure that this table refers to?
No, Senator.
Okay, can you give us an indication of the quantum of this measure?
That measure more relates to domestic infrastructure and capacity.
So either that line item or the next two, which refer to industry capacity for naval shipbuilding or submarines.
Yep.
The $262 million recently announced in South Australia, does that refer to one of these three items?
I'm not too sure what the announcement is that you were referring to. Certainly,
well, it's the one Minister Conroy made and put out media releases about.
Yeah.
What media release? Perhaps you could give us a date, Senator. We've had this situation before where we've had a generalised reference to a thing allegedly done by a minister. It's more helpful if we can get a little more precision, and then we can actually find the answer that you're looking for.
I will come back, but I'm sure there is somebody, whether it's Mr McDowell or somebody within the department, who is aware of the $262 million that was recently announced, as in this year, in South Australia, who can provide that information. But if not, I'll have my staff look it up and give you a date.
If you just give us the date, then we can find it online. It's very easy.
So if I may, Senator, the items in the portfolio additional estimates statement, so nuclear-powered submarine infrastructure and capacity investment, that was related to ASC, and there is another line in there as well which relates to the Henderson consolidation. Obviously, that's not a South Australia announcement, but that was also announced as a measure but covered within the defence budget.
Can we also then go to other areas in defence, and I'd particularly like to go to the operating expenses, so table 8B in the portfolio additional estimate statements. And what it highlights there is that there's a variation in our operating costs of minus 185 million. Interested to understand, as we look at a number of absorbed measures across a range of parts of defence where that impact is being felt, can you give us an understanding as to why, at a time when we are saying there's increasing threats and roles for the ADF to be conducting, we're seeing a reduction in funding for operations?
In table 8B, Senator, our operations is at serial number 2. It is showing a slight increase from the 24-25 budget, in that it has grown from 223.8 million to 332.1. That reflects the additional no win, no loss funding that we had received as part of the additional estimates process. The operating line, which perhaps you were referring to at serial 5 in table 8B, the majority of that 185 reduction was actually a reclassification where we'd moved how we were representing funding internally from operating to sustainment.
Sure.
So it's not a loss, it's a transfer into the sustainment program, which is at serial 4.
Okay. The concern I have, though, in terms of the reductions in budget, whether it's a reclassification or however you want to describe it, goes back to evidence that we finally got out of defence in, I think, over a 3-year period after the change of government in 2013, that the unfunded liability that had accrued from a number of absorbed measures, particularly in operating expenses in real estate and infrastructure, ended up at over $16 billion, was what Mr Richardson finally admitted to estimates. And so when I look at things like security and estate sustainment in table 10, and I see minus 90.3, can you describe to the committee why that figure has reduced? If we take anything out of the Pappas review that was done back in 2009, we know that the ownership costs of a state continue to rise at least as quick as the civil sector, so I'm struggling to see why we're having to spend less on a state unless this is one of the offsets for the many absorbed measures that we're seeing.
Senator, ultimately we need to manage the overall defence budget within the funding that we have. Between budget and additional estimates, we have seen strong growth in our acquisition budget. The Defence Committee within Defence made a decision that we would move some funding from sustainment for this financial year to alleviate some of the pressures in the acquisition budget that we were seeing. And what you're seeing against the security and estate line is a reflection of that, in that we moved some of our budget in sort of relatively, in percentage terms, fairly small adjustment to the sustainment program to the acquisition program.
Sure. And I recognise in table 9 that there is an increase in that, but the point there is the concerns coming from Australian industry point to people like Colonel Vaughan, I think it was, at an industry briefing, who highlighted that foreign military sales have increased by some 72% since the AUKUS announcement, which means industry is seeing that the decline they have in revenue and the decline they have in workforce that was reported by the Australian Defence magazine last year is a consequence of defence spending more overseas rather than here in Australia. So how does that align with the government's Made in Australia policy and their commitment to build Australia's defence industry capability to support defence?
Senator, I would say there's lots of pressures on the defence budget, and yes, we are seeing increases in FMS, both from a perspective of what we're acquiring, but also the cost of what we're acquiring. But likewise, domestically, we're seeing some of those inflationary impacts coming through and impacting on what we can afford domestically as well, whether that's acquisition or sustainment. So we are seeing those pressures, and it's a constant juggle, as you would imagine, in making sure that we are delivering the defence budget without overspends, and that's certainly the principal focus that we have, and as doing that, at times we need to move money between some of those categories to different priorities.
Authorised Senator David Fawcett, Liberal Party, Adelaide.